All right, so let's start with this thought experiment. It sounds totally sci-fi, but it gets right to the heart of what we're talking about today. Imagine this, right? You're going about your life, making choices, feeling like you're in control. Then, boom, you find out aliens put a tiny device in your brain when you were born. And this device, it's basically been pulling the strings the whole time. It causally determined every single choice you've ever made, including, let's say, a really bad one, like deciding to kill poor Mr. Plum. So the big question is, are you free? I mean, are you responsible for what happened to Mr. Plum if this thing was controlling you?
Yeah, that's the classic manipulation argument scenario. It's designed to really push our buttons on free will and responsibility. We're diving deep into that whole long-running philosophical wrestling match,
Yeah.
between feeling free and the possibility that everything is just causal determinism. For ages, the standard line, the sort of orthodox view in philosophy, was pretty clear. Find a hidden controller like that alien device. Okay, game over for free will. And no free will means no moral responsibility. Simple as that. Or so we thought.
Right. But the source material we're digging into today really throws a wrench in those works. It challenges that fundamental assumption. We've got some really fascinating recent studies from experimental philosophy, X-Fi, as they call it.
Yeah.
And they're looking at something philosophers usually just brushed aside, the scope of the manipulation.
Exactly. It's asking this question that sounds simple but has huge implications. Does it actually matter if you're the only one with the alien device or if everyone has one? I mean, intuitively, or at least according to traditional philosophy, it shouldn't make a blind bit of difference, right? If the device cancels your free will, it cancels everyone's free will if they have it too. Scope is irrelevant. That's been the bedrock assumption.
Okay, so our mission today is to explore this new evidence that suggests, well, maybe that bedrock assumption is wrong. Maybe it's not so irrelevant after all. We're going to unpack why your free will, or at least our judgments about it, might depend less on what's happening inside your head and more on, well, how you stack up against everyone else around you. It kind of forces us to think about this idea of the philosophy of scope. Could that be the key? Okay, let's unpack this properly.
So to really get what's going on with this new research, we absolutely have to get clear on these three specific thought experiments they used. They're all built around this character, Katie, and her rather unfortunate decision regarding Mr. Plum.
Yeah, we do need to take our time here because the subtle differences between these three Katies, that's everything. That's the whole setup. They're designed to isolate different things. Is it about being the only one?
Yes.
Scope, is that about who or what is doing the determining type? Is it about whether they meant for it to happen? Intention? Let's start with the first one, the classic manipulation case.
Yeah.
The researchers call it existential manipulation. This is case one, just Katie.
Right, so case one, Katie. Looks normal, world seems normal, but crucially, she's the only person in her world with this alien brain implant put there at birth. This device makes it so she has to make the choices she makes. It causally determines them. She couldn't have done otherwise. And importantly, the aliens weren't just messing around. They intended for her to kill Mr. Plum. They programmed the device specifically for that outcome.
Okay, so the gut feeling here, and definitely the traditional philosophical take, is crystal clear. She's not free. How could she be? Her actions trace back to these aliens. She's not the source. So she can't be morally responsible for Mr. Plum. This feels like the baseline, right? The most obvious example of free will being canceled out. And the key word here is existential. The manipulation only applies to her, just one existing person.
Exactly. Now hold that thought, because here comes the twist. Case two. Universal manipulation, we meet Katie. That's Katie Starr. Now, Katie is identical to Katie in every single internal way. Same device, same causal determination, same alien intention behind it, kill Mr. Plum. The only difference, and this is crucial, is relational. It's about her world. Everyone else in Katie's world also has an identical alien device from birth, determining all their actions too.
Whoa. Okay, that's the philosophical pinch point, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because if the device itself, the physical mechanism inside her head, is what kills free will for the first Katie,
Yeah.
why would it suddenly not kill free will for Katie just because her neighbor Bob also has one? Her internal state, the causal chain leading to her action, it hasn't changed at all. It really makes you question if freedom is just an inside job.
Precisely. If the old guard is right, if scope truly is irrelevant, then people should judge Katie and Katie exactly the same. Unfree, not responsible. End of story. But if this new experimental philosophy, this focus on scope, is on to something, then people are going to judge Katie as more free and more responsible than the original Katie. That's the prediction.
Okay, so one more case to keep things clear. Case 3 is designed to shift gears from manipulation by agents to just the way the universe works. This is universal determination. Meet Katie. Katie, double star.
Right. With Katie, the scope is still universal. Just like Katie, everyone in her world is causally determined. So whatever choice she makes, she was always going to make it. But, and this is the key difference, there's no alien device. There's no manipulator. She's determined by the ordinary laws of nature, plus all the facts about the past. This is basically the standard definition of causal determinism that philosophers argue about all the time. Impersonal, no specific agent pulling the strings.
Got it. So, Katie, just her, alien device, intentional manipulation, Katie, everyone, alien device, intentional manipulation, Katie, everyone, no device, just the impersonal laws of physics and history. This setup lets them really tease apart what bothers us. Is it being singled out, Katie versus Katie? Or is it having an agent controlling things versus just impersonal laws, Katie versus Katie?
Exactly. It allows us to ask, do people react negatively to manipulation specifically, or to determinism itself, regardless of the source? That's what these cases help us figure out. #Tag2, competing hypotheses and the free will debate.
Okay, so before these kinds of experiments started shaking things up, the philosophical debate had sort of settled into certain patterns, right? Especially around arguments trying to shoot down compatibilism.
Oh, absolutely. Compatibilism, the idea that free will can exist even if the universe is totally deterministic, even if everything is caused by prior events and laws, that's always been a tough pill for some philosophers to swallow. And manipulation arguments were the big weapon against it. The strategy was clever, really.
How did that work exactly?
Well, you start with a case everyone agrees on, like our original Katie, controlled by aliens. Everyone, even the compatibilist, tends to say, okay, yeah, she's not free or responsible. Clear manipulation. Then the argument tries to show that there's no relevant difference between being controlled by aliens and being controlled or determined by the impersonal laws of nature. If you admit Katie isn't free, and there's no good reason to distinguish your case from someone in a deterministic universe, well, then you have to admit the person in the deterministic universe isn't free either. It forces the compatibilist's hand. Ah, okay. So that core idea that any determination by outside factors kills freedom, that's basically the determinism hypothesis.
Pretty much. The claim is stark. If an agent, let's call her Agent A, is causally determined by factors beyond her control full stop, doesn't matter what those factors are, then she's not free and not morally responsible. The determination itself is the problem. Not the source, not the scope, just the fact of being determined.
And that's the logic behind famous arguments like Pereboom's four-case argument. I've heard of that one.
Exactly. Robert Pereboom sets up the sequence. Case one might be, neuroscientists fiddling with someone's brain directly to cause an action. Clearly unfree. Then case two makes the manipulation a bit earlier, maybe programming at birth. Case three makes it even more subtle, like strict upbringing. Until finally, case four is just plain old causal determinism by laws and the past. Pereboom argues there's no principled place to draw a line between case one and case four. If one is unfree, four must be too. It cleverly uses our strong intuition against direct external manipulation, like Katie, to argue against plain old determinism, like Katie. That sounds pretty compelling, actually. It puts the compatibilist in a tight spot.
It does. If you're an incompatibilist, someone who thinks free will and determinism just can't coexist, this line of argument feels very powerful. Determination is the freedom killer.
But the compatibilists must have had a comeback, right? They didn't just roll over.
No, definitely not. They pushed back with what we can call the manipulator hypotheses. Their counter move was to say, hold on, maybe it's not the determination we object to, maybe it's the manipulator. The source of the determination is what matters morally.
Okay, so how does that work? What's the difference?
Well, the argument is that we balk at the alien device scenario, not just because Katie's actions are determined, but because there's another agent involved, the aliens, who are responsible for setting things up that way. It undermines her status as the unique source. There's a broader version of the non-intentional manipulator hypothesis. This says freedom is defeated if any other agents are the source of the determination, even if they didn't, say, intend for Katie to kill Mr. Plum. Maybe they just set up a simulation she's living in,
Okay, and the narrower version?
That's the intentional manipulator hypothesis. This one says, no, freedom is only undermined if the manipulator, like the aliens, specifically intended that particular outcome, the killing of Mr. Plum, and set things up to make sure it happened. It requires malicious intent, basically.
So if a compatibilist picks one of those,
they can say, sure, Katie with the alien device isn't free because there's an intentional, maybe just any manipulator involved. But, they continue, Katie, who's just determined by impersonal laws of nature in the past, she is free. Because laws aren't agents. Laws don't intend anything. It breaks that chain Pereboom tried to forge.
Right. It lets them separate the manipulation cases from the determinism case. But here's the kicker for our deep dive today. All these arguments, all this back and forth between the determinism hypothesis and the manipulator hypotheses, they pretty much just ignored the Katie versus Kitty difference, didn't they?
Yeah. Completely. They all implicitly assumed that if the device makes one person unfree, it makes everyone unfree if they all have it. That assumption about scope being irrelevant was just kind of baked in until now.
Yeah, that baked-in assumption, the idea that if some factor F, like an alien device, kills free will for one person, then finding out F applies to everyone just means nobody's free. The researchers gave that a name. They called it the universal defeater principle.
And you can see why that would seem obvious, especially if you hold what philosophers call an internalist theory of free will, right? Like, if you think freedom is all about something deep inside you, maybe a soul, or special rational powers, or some weird quantum indeterminacy in your brain synapses.
Exactly. If freedom is purely an internal property, then what's happening with everyone else seems totally beside the point. Your freedom is about your plumbing, not your neighbor's. Why should the scope of manipulation change anything fundamental about you?
And you mentioned Peter van Inwagen earlier, a really big figure in this debate, an incompatibilist. He basically endorsed this universal defeater principle. He did. He acknowledged, sure, there are differences between, say, Martians controlling you and just plain old determinism. But he explicitly said he couldn't see why our judgments about freedom should change if everyone had a Martian device controlling them. If it defeats freedom for one, it defeats it for all. And because philosophers relied on that principle, they felt justified using these very specific existential cases, one person being manipulated to draw grand conclusions about universal conditions, like whether determinism itself rules out freedom for everybody.
Okay, so the whole anti-compatibilist strategy, using manipulation cases like pair booms, kind of leans heavily on this universal defeater principle being true, or at least intuitively compelling.
Absolutely. It's a crucial pillar.
So if the experimental work shows that ordinary people don't follow that principle, that their intuitions actually do change depending on scope,
then the pillar starts to crumble, and that's where the radical alternative comes in, the one Latham and Tierney, the researchers in our source material, focus on, the existential hypothesis.
Okay, lay that one on us. What's the core idea?
The existential hypothesis flips the script. It says, maybe the reason we judge the single manipulated agent Katie as unfree isn't because of the determination itself, but precisely because the manipulation only affects her. She's singled out. In a world where everyone else is seemingly acting on their own steam, this one person being controlled by an external force looks, well, defective, abnormal, different. And that's what triggers our negative judgment. It's the relational fact, the isolation, not the mechanism of control itself.
Wait, hang on. That feels weird, doesn't it? Metaphysically, I mean. Why should being alone in my puppetness make me less free than if everyone else is also a puppet on identical strings? My strings are still being pulled.
It does feel weird if you're stuck on that internalist picture. But that's the challenge this hypothesis poses. It suggests our concept of freedom, or at least our judgments about responsibility, are deeply interwoven with social context and normalcy. It's not just about the nuts and bolts inside your head.
Okay, so if the existential hypothesis is right, what does that do to the connection between the Katie case and the determinism case?
It drives a huge wedge between them, a permanent one. Because causal determinism, if it's true, is universal by definition. It applies to everything, everywhere, all the time. So if our strong negative reaction is only triggered by existential manipulation, by being singled out, then we can't learn anything meaningful about universal determinism, like Katie, by looking at cases of solitary manipulation, like Katie. The intuition doesn't transfer. Our gut feeling against Katie isn't really about determinism. It's about the unfairness or abnormality of her specific situation.
Wow. Okay, so those big arguments like pair booms that tried to slide from clear manipulation to universal determinism, they might be based on an intuition that's actually sensitive to the wrong thing, sensitive to scope, not just determination.
That's precisely the possibility these experiments were designed to test. Is the universal defeater principle how people actually think? Or does the existential hypothesis provide a better map of our moral psychology? Let's look at the data.
Right, so the study we're digging into here got, I think it was over 400 people to read these different Katie vignettes. They carefully varied things to hit all the angles we've discussed. So some people read about existential manipulation, others read about universal, some read about intentional manipulation by aliens, others about non-intentional manipulation, and some read about just plain old impersonal determinism.
And they didn't just ask, is she free? They got more specific, right? measured a few different things.
Yeah, they use these 7-point scales, where 1 is strongly disagree and 7 is strongly agree.
Yeah.
They asked participants to rate their agreement with 3 key statements about Katie in whichever scenario they read. 1, Katie is morally responsible for killing Mr. Plum. 2, Katie kills Mr. Plum of her own free will. 3, Katie deserves blame for killing Mr. Plum.
That third one, deserves blame, that sounds important. Why isolate that? It is important. It taps into this idea philosophers call basic desert responsibility. It's not just about whether blaming her is useful, like deterring others. It's about whether she fundamentally deserves blame, in a deep moral sense, just for what she did. Incompatibilists often argue that even if we say people are responsible in a determined world, they don't have this basic desert. So finding out if people think determined agents do deserve blame is a really direct test of whether folk intuition leans compatibilist or incompatibilist.
Okay, makes sense. So let's get to the juicy stuff. What did they find? Did scope actually matter?
Oh yeah, big time. Key finding 1. The existential universal effect is real scope matters decisively. This wasn't ambiguous. Across all 3 judgments, free will, moral responsibility, and blameworthiness, there was a significant main effect for scope. People consistently and significantly rated the agents in the universal conditions, like Katie, where everyone had the device, as more free, more responsible, and more deserving of blame than the agents in the existential conditions, like Katie, the only one with the device.
Wow. Can you give us a sense of how big that difference was?
Sure. For moral responsibility, the average score was around 5.7 out of 7 in the universal cases. That's pretty strong agreement that she is responsible. But in the existential cases, the average dropped to about 4.7. That's much closer to the midpoint, leaning towards disagreement or uncertainty. It's almost a full point shift, just based on whether other people shared her condition.
Okay, that really undermines those classic manipulation arguments we talked about, doesn't it? If the intuition that a manipulated Katie isn't responsible only really kicks in when she's the only one.
Exactly. Then you can't use that intuition as a reliable guide to what we should think about universal determinism. The intuition seems to be tracking isolation or abnormality more than the determination itself. The universal defeater principle just doesn't seem to hold for most people.
All right, what about the second big finding? The one about determinism itself.
This one is arguably even more direct challenge to the incompatibilist viewpoint. Key finding 2. Determinism is not generally seen as a threat to responsibility. Remember, the determinism hypothesis claimed any determination beyond control kills responsibility. If that were true, then Katie, determined by laws, should have been judged just as harshly, responsibility-wise, as Katie, determined by aliens, especially in the existential case.
But that's not what happened.
Not at all. In the conditions involving impersonal determinism, just laws in the past, no aliens, there was basically no significant difference in responsibility judgments between the existential case, only Katie is determined, and the universal case, everyone is determined. People rated Katie as pretty responsible in both scenarios.
And how did those responsibility ratings for Katie, determinism, compare to Katie, existential manipulation?
Significantly higher. People saw Katie as much more responsible than the original Katie, who was manipulated by aliens. This strongly suggests that people, ordinary folks, do see a morally relevant difference between being determined by an external agent and being determined by the impersonal structure of the universe. They don't seem to think standard determinism wipes out responsibility.
And what about that basic desert idea? Did people think the determined Katie deserved blame?
Yes. The judgments for deserves blame tracked very closely with the judgments for morally responsible. There wasn't a gap suggesting people thought, well, maybe she's responsible in some superficial way, but doesn't really deserve blame. Nope. The data suggests people found basic desert blameworthiness perfectly compatible with impersonal determinism. They seem to be intuitive compatibilists about responsibility and blame.
Fascinating. Okay, that leaves the third key finding, which sounds like it adds another layer of complexity.
It really does. Key finding 3. Free will and moral responsibility judgments can come apart. We usually assume these two go hand in hand, right? No free will, no responsibility. Or, if you have responsibility, you must have free will.
Yeah, that seems like the standard package.
But the study found this interesting interaction effect. The size of that scope effect, existential versus universal, was different depending on whether people were rating free will or rating moral responsibility.
How so? Where was the biggest difference?
The impact of scope on free will judgments was most dramatic in the intentional manipulation cases. People thought Katie was way less free if she was the only one being intentionally controlled by aliens, existential intentional, compared to when everyone was universal intentional. That specific scenario hit the perception of free will the hardest, lowest free will scores overall.
Okay, so being intentionally singled out really tanks the free will judgment. But what about the responsibility judgment in that same scenario?
That's the twist. The moral responsibility judgments didn't show that same extreme sensitivity to whether the manipulation was intentional or not. For responsibility, the big drivers seem to be just the scope, existential versus universal. Whether the aliens meant to make her kill Plum mattered less for responsibility than it did for free will.
Huh, what does that imply? If intentional manipulation crushes the feeling of free will, but doesn't crush the judgment of responsibility nearly as much.
It implies that, at least in some contexts, especially these relational threat contexts, people might judge someone as lacking what they typically think of as free will, but still hold them morally responsible. It puts serious pressure on that bedrock philosophical assumption that free will, in whatever way we define it, is an absolute requirement for moral responsibility. Maybe the link is looser than we thought.
So, to sum up the findings, scope matters hugely. Impersonal determinism isn't seen as a responsibility killer, and our ideas about free will and responsibility might not be as tightly linked as philosophers often assume.
That's a pretty good summary of the experimental bombshells, yeah. The data really does challenge some long-held assumptions in the field.
Okay, so we've seen the data. People's judgments about freedom and responsibility are really sensitive to these purely relational and circumstantial facts, as the paper puts it. It's not just about what's inside you, but how you compare to others. What does this mean for the big philosophical theories out there? Who does this help and who does this hurt?
Well, it definitely creates some headaches for those internalist theories we mentioned earlier. Remember, those are the views that say free will is all about some deep fact internal to the agent's soul, reason, indeterminism, whatever. It's got nothing to do with the neighbors. If these experimental findings are right, and this external relational fact about scope dramatically changes judgments, then internalists have a problem. They either have to say, well, the public is just wrong, their intuitions are flawed, which is a bit awkward.
Yeah, dismissing large-scale empirical data is a tough look.
Right. Or they have to somehow revise their purely internalist definition of freedom to make room for these relational factors, which kind of undermines the whole point of internalism in the first place.
So internalists are on the back foot. What about other approaches? Does this data fit better anywhere else?
It potentially lines up much more comfortably with Strawsonian approaches.
Okay, refresh our memory quickly. What's the core idea of the Strawsonian view, named after the philosopher P.F. Strawson?
Exactly. Strawson argued we should stop looking for some deep metaphysical basis for responsibility, like free willpower or whatever. Instead, he said, look at our actual human practices of holding each other responsible. Look at our reactive attitudes, things like resentment, indignation, gratitude, forgiveness. These feelings and reactions are what constitute moral responsibility. To be responsible is to be the sort of being towards whom these attitudes are appropriately directed. It grounds responsibility in our social lives.
I see the connection now. If responsibility is rooted in our social practices and reactions.
Then it makes perfect sense that a change in the social context, like whether manipulation is existential or universal, would change our reactions and thus our judgments. If only Katie is manipulated, it singles her out, it disrupts the normal flow of reactive attitudes. We might pity her or see her as outside the moral community in that respect. Holding her responsible feels inappropriate within that social dynamic. But if everyone is manipulated, Katie, well, that's just the new baseline reality for that community. The conditions for holding each other responsible for the reactive attitudes to function within that context are restored. So we go back to holding Katie responsible because relative to her world, she's a normal participant in the moral game.
That fits the data really well. The relational fact changes the social practice, which changes the judgment.
It does seem like a good fit. However, there's still that tricky bit from key finding 3. If the experiment suggests that free will judgments and responsibility judgments can sometimes diverge, like when people judge Katie as unfree but still kind of responsible.
Right, the Strawsonians usually think free will is needed to be a fitting target for those reactive attitudes, don't they?
Often, yes. Many compatibilists, including Strawsonians, see free will as the necessary grounding for moral responsibility. If this data suggests they can come apart, then even Strawsonians might need to tweak their story. Maybe our practice of assigning responsibility, of deploying those reactive attitudes, is even more robust, more resilient to perceived deficits in free will than even they thought. Perhaps blame, in particular, hangs on even when classic free will seems compromised by the context.
Interesting. So even the views that seem to fit the data might need some refinement. Let's go back to that really weird result, the universal manipulation case, Katie. People rated her pretty high on freedom and responsibility, even though everyone, including her, was determined by alien devices. That feels so counterintuitive if you think about it abstractly.
It does, and it points toward this really profound idea. Maybe the conditional nature of free will is the right way to think about it.
Conditional. What do you mean by that?
It means maybe our concept of what counts as free will isn't fixed and absolute. Maybe it's conditional on what the world is actually like. Remember Van Inwagen, the incompatibilist, saying if science proved determinism, he'd reluctantly become a compatibilist. He'd basically adjust his concept to fit the facts.
So it's not just giving up. It's more like our standards adapt to reality.
Exactly. Think about it. If we somehow discovered tomorrow that our actual world is like the universal alien device world, that metaphysically it's a world hostile to our ideal notion of freedom, would we all just throw up our hands and say, well, I guess no one's free or responsible for anything? These experiments suggest probably not. We'd likely still find ways to distinguish between actions done freely within that determined context and actions that aren't. Our demand for assigning responsibilities seems incredibly resilient.
So the highest standard of agency available in a given world becomes what we call free in that world.
That's the idea. Our concept of freedom might not be chasing some impossible metaphysical ghost like uncaused causation. It might be tracking the most sophisticated kind of agency that's actually possible given the way things are. If universal determination by laws or even by devices turns out to be the way things are, our practices compel us to find a way to call that free enough for responsibility. And the experimental results, where people grant freedom and responsibility even to Katie, seem to show this adaptive conditional concept in action. People are effectively saying, well, if this is the reality for everyone, then yes, within this reality, she's acting freely and responsibly.
So our moral judgments are maybe more relative and context dependent than absolute and metaphysical. That's a pretty big shift in perspective.
It is. It suggests our folk concepts are deeply pragmatic and geared towards regulating social life, perhaps more than philosophers traditionally credited. Hashtag outro. So, yeah, wrapping up this pretty deep dive into the philosophy of scope, it feels like we've landed on three really significant takeaways that kind of shake up the traditional free will debate. First, scope matters. A lot. That whole universal defeater principle that people just assumed looks like it doesn't match how people actually think, which pulls the rug out from under a lot of classic manipulation arguments.
Right. And second, just plain old determinism being caused by the laws of nature in the past doesn't seem to strike most people as a major threat to moral responsibility or blameworthiness. They draw a line between that and being manipulated by an agent.
Exactly. And third, those judgments about free will and judgments about moral responsibility, they're not always locked together. Free will ratings seem more sensitive to how you're manipulated, especially if it's intentional, while responsibility ratings are more sensitive to whether you're singled out of the scope. They can come apart.
Which suggests the relationship between the two concepts is maybe more complicated, more nuanced than just one requires the other. Okay, that's definitely a lot to chew on. It shows just how intricate our everyday moral thinking really is. But, as promised, we've got one last little brain teaser for you, something to mull over, building on this research.
Yeah, this is something the study itself didn't directly test, but it's a natural next question.
Everything we discussed today revolved around a morally bad action. Katie killing Mr. Plum, and judgments of blame. What about good actions? What about praise? Does the existential universal effect work the same way for praiseworthy actions?
Think about it. If an agent is manipulated by aliens, but this time to perform some wonderfully heroic or beneficial act, would we praise them less if they were the only one manipulated? The existential case again. Or would we only give them full credit if everyone in their world was similarly manipulated to do good deeds? The universal case.
That's a great question, because philosophers often talk about asymmetries between praise and blame. Sometimes we seem quicker to find excuses for bad behavior than we are to give full credit for good behavior, or maybe vice versa, depending on the theory. So, could it be that our positive reactions, our willingness to praise, are affected differently by scope than our negative reactions? Is being singled out for manipulation less damaging to praise than it is to blame? Or more?
Does the goodness of the outcome interact with the scope of the cause in determining how much credit someone gets? It's an open question and potentially a really interesting area for future research.
Absolutely. Something for you to ponder. Is our sense of freedom more crucial when we're assigning blame compared to when we're giving praise? Okay, that wraps up our deep dive into the philosophy of scope and its surprising impact on free will. We hope this journey through Katie, and Katie has given you a solid shortcut to understanding this fascinating corner of philosophy. It really shows that sometimes figuring out if you're free involves looking not just inside yourself, but at everyone else around you.